Hello and welcome to Energy Voice Out Loud. I'm Aberdeen Features Lead Ryan Duff, and joining me this week is COMET Head of Investigations, Alan Smith, who has decades of experience in investigating criminal and industrial incidents. We discussed how to prevent offshore accidents and what happens when there's a murder on a rig. So Alan, you spoke to me a little bit earlier about how you transitioned from the police into investigations in the industry, but could you tell me a little bit about your career building up to that, because you've got quite a story.
Yeah, it is. I probably best describe myself as a kind of career investigator. It's all I've ever done. So I joined what was Grampian Police at the age of 18, and for the next 30 years followed a career as a detective, and fortunately I finished in a role that gave me oversight of all major serious crime in the region, which was fascinating in terms of all the kind of murder and mayhem. But I think more fittingly for this, that particular role also had a unique aspect to it, because we had the jurisdictional responsibility for policing the North Sea oil and gas sector. And the role that I held often saw me having to investigate, with a team obviously, offshore tragedies. And all too often I found myself investigating these incidents, life-changing events. And over time I kind of saw a pattern developing where good organisations that didn't want these events to happen, they didn't seem particularly good at preventing repeat failure. So these events are truly awful, but they're compounded if the organisation, during the course of the investigation, recognises that they've missed an opportunity to put in place some form of intervention that could have prevented it. And this is what I was seeing. So I knew instinctively when a police career came to an end that I was going to move into the world of industry investigations. And that's a completely different animal to a criminal investigation. So I had to kind of change my psyche in terms of my investigation philosophy, if you like.
Well, that's it. And, you know, I've heard you speak at events in the past, and you've mentioned the idea that when investigating for the police, you're looking for the whodunit, whereas when you're investigating for industry.
Yeah, absolutely. So, you know, a criminal investigation is absolutely all about blame. It's all about guilt. It's all about getting the person responsible and bringing them to justice. Whereas in industry, it's a polar opposite. You're looking to investigate. You want to understand what and why the incident happened, but you're not looking to attribute blame or individual blame or guilt, because there's no place in that. Now, that doesn't mean that there's not human error involved, because I could confidently say that every investigation that I've done industry-wise has involved a degree of individual or collective human error to a smaller or greater degree that contributed to the incident. Now, it's important to identify human error and accept that human error is almost inevitable. But if you stop your investigation at the point of investigating or identifying human error, then that's not a good investigation, because human error is a symptom of a deeper ailment, if you like, in the organisation, and that's what you want to get to the heart of. So I would suggest organisations who have got incidents where human errors are a feature, that really ought to be the starting point for your investigation. Whereas I often see when I'm reviewing, we do reviews of investigations for clients, and it's amazing how often I'll see the investigation stop at the point of identifying human error, and it's so frustrating for me, because I'm thinking, no, you need to get the understanding of why good people make mistakes. Nobody comes to work with a malicious intent to have to make a mistake that leads to an incident. But it happens, and it happens regularly. So the focus really ought to be not on the individual who made the error. The focus ought to be on what is it within the kind of system or the organisation that led that individual to make the mistake. You know, what were the influencing factors that sits behind that error? And if you can use your investigation to uncover those, then you'll find 9 times out of 10 it's something within the system or the organisation that leads that individual. There's an investigative technique that I'm a great fan of that it talks about this substitution test, and it's very straightforward in the sense that if you've got an incident where human error is a feature, and you look at the individual involved and you ask the question, okay, that's gone wrong today, but could somebody else who performs that similar role, could they make the same mistake tomorrow or the next day? And typically the answer will be yes. Well, you know then it's got nothing to do with the individual. It's the context in which these individuals are working. So that's quite a good way of finding these things out.
That is really interesting. And when maybe to put that into context a little bit, that sort of thought process of how you piece this together, is there any incidents that you've investigated in industry that particularly jump out at you as poignant, or something that it latched onto you, you've sort of taken it forward with you?
I've been privileged in many ways to get the opportunity by clients to investigate incidents that are their darkest moment, if you like. Nobody wants incidents, but often I get the opportunity to come in and support clients when they've had a particularly difficult or challenging investigation. If I was to make one observation that jumps out at me, it's two little words: if only. And I hear this time and time again when I'm doing investigations. And it's the regret, if you like, that if only we had done something earlier, if only we had acted on the feedback from the guys in the work site, if only we had acted on our instinct, could we have prevented the incident? And all too often that's the case. And there is one incident that springs to mind. It was around about 3 years ago, and it was a really tragic incident where a young man had life-changing injuries. He thankfully survived, but the injuries were awful. And during the course of the investigation, it transpired that around about 3 or 4 months earlier, the organisation had an almost identical incident, but the consequences were much less. It was classified as a near miss. And it was investigated to an extent, and there were preventive actions identified, but they were never enacted. It wasn't seen as a priority. Because the consequences of the first incident were low, it wasn't prioritised. Now, had they affected these actions earlier, there's a very, very strong possibility the second incident wouldn't have occurred. Now, you can just imagine that from the organisational perspective in terms of deep regret, and the family in terms of frustration and anger. And from an investigation point of view, you think, how preventable was this, And there's an argument about, and I read a lot about this, and it was recently spoken about at a conference that Step Change spoke about, are all accidents preventable? And I would subscribe to the view that almost all incidents, industry-wise, are preventable, because the signals are there. There's been, very rarely are you going to have a serious event where there hasn't been precursors or signals indicating that something's afoot. So for an organisation to find themselves in a situation where they could have proactively prevented an incident like that is truly awful. And you get one chance at these things.
That's quite interesting, the idea of that incident where there was a near miss, then pretty much the same thing happened, but it wasn't a near miss, it happened. Yeah. How frustrating is that for you with your policing background? Because the only thing I can think of that would be a similar kind of thing in criminal law would be attempted murder and murder. Yeah. We still investigate attempted murders, we still find out what caused that.
Yeah, because the intent was there. Okay, the consequence perhaps wasn't as serious. But if I'm going to stab you, what's my intent? I want to, don't worry. But you don't necessarily know what the consequence is. If you discharge a firearm, you don't necessarily know what the consequence is. But equally, the guilty intent, if you like, is there. So we don't talk about guilty intent within industry investigations, but organisations do have a responsibility to investigate. Now, you don't need, a serious incident to get serious learning. Again, what do I mean by that? I see time and time again, it frustrates me. You see organisations who have got high volume, low consequence incidents, and they don't investigate them with much rigour because they don't prioritise them as an issue. Whereas to me, they're gold dust. You don't want to be investigating seriously your first, incident when it's serious, when there's been a bad outcome. If you can see the wisdom in actually investigating, these minor incidents with rigour and put in place preventive actions proactively, then you are going to prevent future serious incidents. But I see all too often they get trivialised, and that is so frustrating.
I mentioned the idea of murder before, and about, we spoke about this before recording, the idea that I think 90% of murders are spontaneous, but there are premeditated murders. And you described the idea of someone sitting down and thinking about, how do I get away with this? How do I find an alibi? What do I do? As a risk assessment.
Yeah, it is, yeah.
Right. So when you transferred your skill from criminal investigation to industry, did you immediately see that connection as a risk assessment?
No, it took a while, but and you're right that I have done a presentation around this topic of risk assessing the perfect murder, and it is a bit quirky, but I'll give you the context of it. So when I was when I was a senior detective, I was heavily involved in the investigation into a premeditated murder where a guy had sat down and decided he was going to kill his wife. And so he thought about it in terms of, he didn't do a formal risk assessment, but he did sit down and think, okay, if I'm going to do this, the ultimate consequence is that I'm going to get life imprisonment. So I need to make sure that whatever I plan is going to succeed. And he very nearly did. He very nearly planned the perfect murder. He ultimately got caught, and he's now serving life imprisonment. However, in the investigation of that, it struck me, he got the big parts of it right. He did the big things well. What let him down was the seemingly inconsequential little things in the margin of his planning. And ultimately it was these 6 or 7 little mistakes that he made, misjudgments, that collectively, cumulatively, led to him being convicted of murder. Now, if you take that logic into the world of industry, if an organisation are planning a high-risk activity where the consequences of getting it wrong could be fatal, some drilling into a high-pressure, high-temperature well, or maybe a huge lifting operation, they need to get that right. So they then will similarly sit down and plan the activity. And if that goes wrong, and I've investigated many that have gone wrong, what I'll typically find is it's not the big things, it's not the big parts of the plan that go wrong. It's a number of smaller things around the edges that either got overlooked or weren't given the same level of detail. And collectively, because you never get an incident where one thing has gone wrong. Never. It's always a series of small failures that cumulatively create the ingredients for an incident. So if you've got 4 or 5 mistakes that align, or issues that align on a day, and they could be a human error, it could be a kind of organisational shortfall, or it could be some sort of equipment failure. But if they come together on the day, you've got the ingredients for your incident. So, it's very difficult to just look at an incident and say, I know what caused that, because it's probably not just that. It'll be many other factors around it.
And that cycles back to what you were speaking about at the top of this show, about the idea of these sort of looking at the environment rather than the whodunit.
Correct.
And that sort of gold dust you described there is quite interesting.
That's right.
Firms should be focusing more on the little things that are going wrong rather than... Obviously, they've got to focus on the big things and how they fix that. But
you're absolutely right. I was talking at a conference recently on the topic of human error, and I kind of wanted to give the audience, a call to action at the end of it. Because it's all very well imparting a few stories and telling a few, tales around the investigation, but you want something positive coming out of it. And what I'd said to organisations is that every organisation, and I look around this room, is full of error traps. It's full of potential trip-ups, things that could go wrong.
I'm sure our production crew's delighted about the fact that you've said there's so many things that
and
can
I'm
go
looking
wrong
at
here.
this, what could possibly go wrong in this room, But seriously, I urge the audience, I says, go and do not an egg hunt like we do at Easter, go and do an error hunt. Go back to your workplace, sit down with your team, describe a few errors, traps. What am I talking about? Procedures that are overly long, overly complex, rules that nobody follows, distractions in the workplace that could possibly trip you up or cause harm. And go and proactively seek some out, fix them, because typically it's not difficult to fix them. And if you were to carry out a few of these error trap hunts, if you like, I can tell you proactively you're going to reduce the likelihood of future incidents. Now, that might sound very simplistic, but organisations would do well to have an annual error trap hunt.
Every Easter, there we go. That's the call to
Never mind
action.
the
March
eggs.
is round the corner.
Go and do an error hunt, not an egg hunt.
So, with your experience in investigation, you're looking at these incidents and looking at the small ones and that sort of gold dust you described.
Yeah.
What's the next step? Because obviously, if you look at these small incidents, you can maybe prevent the big ones. But is there a deeper level that we can go to?
Yeah, if I had it's not a dream, but if I could aspire to the next level of where could we take investigations, it would be into the world of proactivity. Yeah. So what I mean is, if we could ever get to the point where organisations were smart enough, robust enough, and resourced enough to conduct root cause learning, understanding failure before an incident occurs, that's a whole different space. At the moment, we tend to wait till the bad things happened. I'll come along with the team, we'll do an investigation, we'll get causation, we'll put in place actions. And that's good, that's important. But how much more powerful would it be if organisations used this logic, philosophy, proactively? So when they conduct an audit, and get a non-conformance, well, a non-conformance is an incident without consequence. You can still investigate a non-conformance. Typically, organisations don't do any form of root cause analysis around non-conformances in audits. They put in place corrective actions, often without understanding why. So if you could move the dial to doing this type of activity proactively, where there's much more opportunity, because incidents are quite rare, thankfully, but non-conformances and audits happen every day, so that the opportunity is vast for organisations who are smart and mindful to do that. And that's what I would like to see and hope to see, because that really would put a line in the sand in terms of incident prevention, which is the holy grail of everything we do. How do we prevent organisations going through this cycle of repeat failure? If you could break that cycle, it's going to be at the point of doing this stuff proactively.
Now, obviously, you've touched on this sort of causal reasoning approach to investigations quite a few times, and I think it's plain to see for myself, and I'm sure anyone listening, that that's quite a passion of yours.
Absolutely.
And looking at your transition between policing to industry, that obviously led to you joining COMET.
Yeah.
And that passion plays a big role in that, right?
Absolutely. Unashamedly, when I did leave the police, I knew exactly what I wanted to do. I'd seen too many unnecessary, predictable, preventable tragedies. And I knew that I wanted to do something in that space. And so when I transitioned out of criminal investigation into the world of industry investigation, I began a journey around root cause analysis and trying to understand what was the causation. So there's a definite distinction. A criminal investigation is all about what happened. An industry investigation is not only what happened, but why did it happen? And it's only when you get to the why can you apply the fix. So I knew there was a kind of journey to go on. And I began with a traditional existing root cause analysis company. I got trained up with them, spent a couple of years, but it just wasn't working for me. It wasn't quite there. And then I moved to an American based organisation who were big in the world of root cause analysis, pretty much dominating the market space. And I spent a number of years with them, but still I didn't feel it had the complete solution. I was doing training, I was doing investigations, and I was continually coming up with clients saying, yeah, but there's still something missing. And I knew what that something was, and I got the privilege working with a client, an individual who ended up as the group head of safety for Lloyd's Register. And together we worked in a project over a year building what is now the system COMET that we work with. And there's several distinctions there, and I don't particularly want to speak about the product as a topic, but the philosophy is important here to get across. If you investigate incidents on a case-by-case basis, and you get causation and you move on to the next one, that's interesting. But what's truly fascinating to me is if you can take an organisation and look at its minor incidents, its serious incidents, its safety incidents, its non-safety incidents, because root causes don't come with a label. And if you can take all of the incidents, failures, shortfalls in your organisation, determine root cause using the same methodology, and collate that data into one place, you can then mine what we call systemic root cause, issues that probably 20% root cause that give you 80% of your pain. That is manna from heaven for organisations. But most organisations, they've got this kind of notion that we'll use a system for our serious incidents, but for the minor stuff, we can do a 5Y or some other type non-productive methodology. So they're comparing apples with pears. They're not looking at their incidents through the same spectrum, through the same lens. COMET does exactly that. It takes your serious, your minor, your near misses, not only safety, it looks at environmental spills, project failures, it looks at lost production, it looks at everything that you don't want to happen in your business, productivity-wise and safety-wise. It collates all that into one place, and it allows you then to mine, truly mine, root cause failure. And from that, you get root cause learning. And that's the holy grail of what we're seeking to do using our methodology. I'm not saying other methodologies don't work, but they're more aligned to a single incident by incident, which is interesting, but it's not fascinating.
Obviously, now you cover a wide range of demographics and regions all over the globe.
Uh-huh.
But one of the last things you investigated in the police, at least in the North Sea, was the Bourbon Dolphin, the capsize of that.
2008, yeah.
And you spoke a little bit about, one of the, I believe, 8 people that lost their lives in that incident was the captain's 14-year-old son.
14-year-old son, yeah.
And that, that was a major culture shock for yourselves, because, why was a boy that young on the vessel? Do you often encounter, when you go to different regions, sort of these culture shocks of like, well, why did you allow that to happen? Because that's not how we do things.
So I'm really privileged in the role that I have, that I get invited to help organisations when they're at their darkest moment, if you like, when they've had these incidents. And I've got to be really cognizant of differing standards in acceptability of safety. Because you're right, that incident, the Bourbon Dolphin, it was a huge surprise to us, of course, that the incident occurred and the massive loss of life. The investigation of the incident, again, showed that it was entirely preventable. You know, what they were doing, anchor handling, you know, that there were signals that were screaming out that maybe we should stop the job, but that didn't happen. To find out that a 14-year-old was on the vessel anchor handling in the North Sea, yeah, it was a massive shock to us, but that's Norwegian culture, and so we shouldn't be surprised. However, when I go abroad to investigate fatalities in the Middle East or the Far East, what we should be mindful of is that the standard of safety in the North Sea oil and gas sector is probably as high as it gets. It's a gold standard, and it really is a safe industry, and we should be proud of that. But it's born out of decades of tragedy where you learn from tragedy. So you have the Piper Alpha disaster. That was a step change in safety. It brought around an entirely different focus to how do we control work and risk in the North Sea oil and gas sector. And over the decades, countries learned from that. Now, recently, I can give you an example. I was in the Middle East to support an investigation team where a 21-year-old had been killed in an industrial accident. And it shocked me. I think I've seen it all, but you know, I think not one single safeguard that you would expect to have in place for a high-risk activity existed. There wasn't one redeeming factor, you know, in terms of competence of those involved in the task. The equipment they were using was out of date. It was, every safety system had been overridden. There was just absolutely no planning into the activity at all, and everything went wrong, and it resulted in a totally unnecessary death, you know. And so when we speak about incidents being preventable, ironically some incidents are even, and this could be controversial, but some incidents are predictable. And sadly, I've seen that where you think, you know, what could possibly go wrong? Well, there wasn't anything that could possibly go right with this particular incident, but thankfully they're rare. That's the exception.
You know, you touched on Norwegian culture briefly there, and you've also spoken about, you know, Middle Eastern sort of culture. But previously, you've spoken about Japan and an incident on a railway.
Yeah, so I, you know, to be clear, I wasn't involved in this incident, but it's an incident I think that I think is a perfect example of how culture can shape behaviours, and how behaviours can often lead to unwanted outcomes. And it was a train crash in Japan several years ago where a driver was trying to make up time. He was running to a very tight schedule, and he went into a corner at a far too fast speed, lost control of the train, and ultimately there was multi-fatalities. And very, very quickly, you know, the media, the organisation pointed the finger of blame specifically at the driver. He drove too fast, that's what caused the accident. Now, I couldn't argue with that in terms of causation. Yeah, he did. He drove too fast, that caused the accident. But when you looked at the underlying reasons why he drove fast, it took you back into the culture of punctuality was unacceptable. Drivers got fined if they were, you know, if the trains were even seconds late. It was very, you know, micromanaged. They were put on embarrassingly retraining programs that was humiliating for their families. And so every incentive was there for train drivers not to be late. So when we look at why he tried to make up time and took that corner too fast, yeah, he was wrong, but behind that there was organisational pressure, and they'd pretty much set their drivers up for failure. So to step back from that and say, yeah, it was the driver's mistake, nah, that's not acceptable. That was the organisation who'd set that driver up for failure. And we see similar types of examples of this where human error tries to get covered up in terms of, you know, it's the individual. And that's a cop-out. for the organisation. Really, it's a cop-out. And an investigator who's truly wanting to challenge human error really needs to get under the skin of why good people make mistakes. And typically, it'll be not the individual. It could be the individual on the day having a bad day, fatigue, stress, morale, all of these can feed into that. But behind that, there's probably more likely to be what we call performance influencing factors in relation to the task or activity in terms of how it was set up and planned on that particular day and executed, or even above that, organisationally, how the kind of management systems within the business and the human factors around the ergonomics of the work site, how have they set their people up for success or failure? And all too often we find that the answers lie within the task or activity set up or the organisational management systems.
You know, cycling back to the blame talking point we mentioned, you know, I guess this also ties into the sort of culture thing that we were discussing as well. Recently, you were in the Middle East, and there was an incident with a crane operator, and by the time you'd got out to investigate the incident, the operator in question was in jail. Now, how do you interact with that? Because obviously that in that part of the world, the police will be operating to their law. That he's been arrested for, you know, for being involved in that incident. How do you then recommend? Well, that's not how I recommend you go forward with this.
Well, of course, the difference there is that the reason the operator and the safety rep who arrived on the scene were in jail is because the police have a different investigative philosophy. They weren't particularly interested in what caused the incident to occur. So they're not investigating it with a view to preventing it in the future. They're absolutely looking at the point is, was there any criminal intent here? Now, once they establish there's no criminal intent, that's their investigation complete. Whereas what I was there to do was to understand what had actually caused this incident to occur. So it's two different perspectives in that regard. You know, to that end, you know, the motivation is entirely different. So you've got to kind of flip that switch.
And do you often have that sort of interaction with local authorities where maybe there's been an arrest made quite quickly after the incident?
No, it's quite rare for that to occur, to be honest with you. Largely, you know, like I was saying earlier, you've got to be cognizant of what are the standards of safety in the region that you're carrying out the investigation, because they do vary. There's a huge spectrum of safety management, and we all have been on holiday and seen construction sites where you think, oh my God, you know, what could possibly go wrong, you know? The guys are up on scaffolding with no PPE, or they're in flip-flops, and you think, wow, no fall arrest. It makes your blood run cold. But it's acceptable there. And so you need to be careful that you don't get high and mighty and apply, you know, 2025 UK standards to what's happening in other parts of the world. So you need to flex your approach. And again, if you go into an investigation with that kind of mindset of even showing judgment or blame or any of that, you're going to immediately lose your investigation. You've got to be open-minded. You've got to, like I said earlier, you've got to try and put yourselves in the shoes of those involved. I've written about investigating within the tunnel. And what I mean by that is, you know, if you're doing your investigation, don't stand back and, you know, be judgmental and you know, what on earth were they thinking of? Get down, get in there, look at what happened through the eyes of those that were involved. Because as I said earlier, they didn't go on to that site that morning. They didn't go to work in the morning thinking, let's have an accident today. They want to get the job done, and unfortunately I had a bad outcome. But nobody maliciously wants these things to happen.
So speaking of criminality, or maybe lack thereof, during your time both in the police and in industrial investigation, you were saying just the other day that you'd never actually come across anything that was specifically criminal.
No. I think you need to be very careful and draw the distinction between a criminal investigation and an industry-based investigation. There's never the twain shall meet, if you like, because, by definition, criminal investigation is where there's guilty intent. You want to cause harm, whereas nobody in industry wants to cause harm. It does happen occasionally, but, there's not that criminal guilty intent that I've ever come across. People don't come to work, or people don't, leadership teams don't run organisations with a hope or intent to harm their people. That's ridiculous, But when it does occur, naturally you need to make sure that they've followed local regulations and that they haven't stepped out with acceptable boundaries in terms of risk management. Then you get into areas where perhaps organisations are maybe vulnerable to that kind of assessment, that they haven't been providing that level of duty or care that they perhaps should have.
So on the idea that you've never sort of investigated something that's overtly criminal, when it comes to looking at sort of recent news headlines, just a couple of years ago we did see something that was overtly criminal offshore. We saw a murder on a Middle East rig,
yeah.
And I've been wanting to speak to you about that.
Okay.
Throughout this whole conversation. When it comes to incidents like that,
yeah.
What is the procedure from a policing standpoint? So from your background in working policing the North Sea with Grampian Police, was there ever a procedure put in place, or is there now a sort of step-by-step of, right, we need to scramble a search and rescue helicopter to, get police on scene or anything like that? Is this kind of a case of like, oh, well, it never happened, so we don't have a plan?
So every offshore operator has to have a duty of duty holders responsibility to plan for a contingency plan for emergency response to whether it's a explosion, evacuation of the rig. So there will be plans in place. Contingency plans will be in place for most eventualities. That's what you do. You think, plan for the worst and hope it never happens. Would you specifically have a plan in place for a crime like a murder offshore? I doubt that very much, because in 30 years I've never seen or heard of that in the North Sea. And I know the example you're speaking about, and it has got a northeast connection in terms of, but no, I don't think there would be specific plans. But the OIM unquestionably would be supported immediately on shore. But as I say, I've never encountered anything like that in the North Sea. It's an extremely rare event. We've had tragic incidents like suicides, because offshore, what we find is that, just by the nature of living and eating and accommodating together on a rig, socialising on the rig, it can become a pressure cooker, and small issues can become big issues, and there's not the same release valve for the guys to have. So yeah, these things do happen, but I think the offshore leadership community are very adept at intercepting and identifying, perhaps pressure building up in a team or between individuals. Now that incident I take it we're talking about the incident in Qatar.
Yes.
These events are extremely rare, and obviously I wasn't involved in it, but I can imagine, having read quite a bit about the events, that again you've got a situation where you've got guys living, sleeping quarters, accommodation, pressures can build up, personality conflicts, all that good stuff that you get in life, but there's not the same release valve perhaps. And this looks like it was an extreme, it was very extreme consequence of one of these situations.
That's really interesting. And you spoke about if and when an incident like this happens, which, as we say, is very rare. But the OIM obviously has a responsibility, and there would be plans, or they'd be assembling plans. You said there would be support from onshore, and when I asked the question, I mentioned policing specifically. When you said support, were you referring to sort of head offices of the company, or were you speaking more about
external
local
support.
authorities?
I mean, there are companies in Aberdeen who specialise in emergency response, supporting clients with that type of incident. That's not what we do. We do encounter it from an investigation point of view, but when a major incident occurs offshore that results in death, then there's initial response in terms of dealing with the incident and the immediate aftermath and recovery. Typically, we come in at the point where the situation has been stabilised, and we then perform the investigation to understand why did it occur, and more importantly, how do we support the client to come up with truly valuable preventive actions that hopefully prevent this repeat failure.
With your background in policing, when it comes to incidents like that shock you and you think this should never have happened, is it difficult not to say? Is it difficult to avoid that pointing blame kind of thing that we discussed at the start and say, well, the people in charge should have seen this months ago and this should never have happened, it's your fault? Is that difficult to do?
You have to be disciplined and drive that bias out of the investigation, because investigation bias is something that you've actively got to be mindful of in every incident that you go into. It's very easy to say, why did they do this, or that doesn't seem very clever. What were they thinking about doing this? So, but that again comes back to my point around, it's not the individual, it's the way that individual or individuals have been set up for failure, typically by the context of what they're doing and the organisation that they work for. But in terms of your point around, is it frustrating? Of course it is frustrating. But you have to work through that. And, I've seen, what does frustrate me is the kind of situation you can be in. And I've been here where you've had a very serious incident, where an incident's occurred, and then you'll get some of the leadership team perhaps saying, you know what, we've got this really good policy, a stop the job policy in place. Why did they just not stop? They must have seen things were going wrong. Why did they not stop? And that kind of hindsight bias, is worthless, because when I investigate, you've got to investigate as if you were in the shoes of the people involved. Because at that point in time, even although they made a mistake, they thought they were doing the right thing. They thought what they were doing was correct. It made sense to them. They're not going to put their lives in danger. So, this post-incident kind of, why did they not think that, or why did they not do that, is valueless. It's annoying. It's frustrating to hear that, because having a policy in place doesn't mean that it's going to get enacted. So what was interesting with that particular individual, I said, well, how long have you had that stop the job policy in place? And years and years. And I said, and how many times have you measured, how many times has that stop the job actually been enacted? And he kind of looked at me and says, no, we don't actually measure that. And I said, well, that's your answer. You've got the policy, you don't know if it's effective, and yet you assume that just because it exists, individuals are going to use it. But the mindset of these guys is positive. They want to get the job done. So why do these incidents occur? Because people are hardwired to do a job, to get it done successfully, to get it done on time, within budget. And they'll go the extra mile to get that done, even tragically if it puts their own lives at risk. I don't know how often we've seen a situation where, if they'd stopped and reassessed, the outcome would have been different. But people just want to drive on and get the job done because they're good people. There's a huge emphasis placed in industry around adherence and compliance with procedures that exist. And of course that's important. But that's assuming, of course, that the procedures are effective. Now, that's a big assumption, because we see investigations where procedures have been bypassed or slightly manipulated. An incident occurs and immediately the client focuses on the guys didn't follow the procedures. That's what caused the incident. No, not necessarily. What we find is that the people who are actually performing the work over time, they become wise to the most effective and safe way of carrying out that activity. And that might not necessarily chime or mirror exactly what the procedure says. So they'll deviate for positive reasons. And then, of course, something will happen and the blame will be, you didn't follow the procedure, that's where the incident happened. No, that's not the case. So I'm a great subscriber to the philosophy that workers are probably your best source of developing and certainly participating in the development of procedures, because they know exactly what requires to be done. And organisations who are mature enough to subscribe to that kind of, and we talk about it as kind of work as intended versus work as done. What do I mean by that? Organisations will have a perception of how they intend work to be carried out as per their procedures. But then when we go and investigate, we find that there's a gap between that work as intended and work in reality as it's done. And it may well be that the work as done is nearer the mark than work as intended. So just because there's a gap or a gulf between those two doesn't necessarily mean that that procedural deviation has caused the incident. You need to be very careful about that. And again, a stark example of that, and it really is, if you think about the tragic events of the Piper Alpha disaster, and I was a young police officer when that happened in 1988, so I wasn't involved in any way with the investigation, but I've since done a 25-year desktop review for a client in America on the Piper Alpha and the objective was, would a modern day investigation and root cause analysis of the Piper Alpha have delivered in any way a different outcome to the original one? In actual fact, the answer is no. It was obviously an extremely thorough investigation. But what always struck me about the Piper Alpha was that the survivors of the Piper Alpha were the ones who didn't follow the procedure to go and muster and wait to be rescued. The ones who survived the Piper Alpha were the ones who self-evacuated from the rig. Contrary to procedures, there's no procedures to jump off the helideck into the North Sea. And so, sadly, the ones who followed the procedures perished. And the ones who deviated from the procedures, many of them survived. Now, I'm not suggesting for 1 minute that deviating from a procedure is a good thing. I'm just saying that you shouldn't necessarily subscribe to always following the procedure. There's going to be a good outcome. That's not the case.
So is that the major conclusion from this chat then? The idea that you spoke about getting to the tunnel and you spoke about listening to the workforce and watching how they operate compared to systems. Is the main conclusion of this to ensure that you're providing best practice to be more engaged with the workforce? It seems like a very simple conclusion, but maybe one that needs to be affirmed.
But there is no dark art to investigations. There's no magic to it. I mean, the reality is, in any investigation, irrespective of whether you use COMET or some other proprietary root cause analysis tool, the quality of the outcome of your investigation will always be determined by the quality of the data that you put into the system. You've heard rubbish in, rubbish out. Well, that's what you get. If you do a rubbish investigation, a superficial investigation, then you're going to get outcomes that are flaky, frankly, and are dangerous, because you might end up implementing an action that's actually not going to resolve the original problem. And so, again, part of our philosophy at COMET is the importance of the discovery phase, that get into the what happened. So you absolutely need to see the incident from the eyes of those involved. And you need to truly understand what motivated them to do what they did or didn't do on that particular day that may have led to a bad outcome. And for that, you have to get into their heads and you have to get the trust of those involved, because you need to understand what they were thinking, what was motivating them. And that's not a particularly simple thing to do in an investigation. So yeah, it's massively important to see it through the perspective of those who are involved in the planning, preparation, supervision, execution of the task. If you don't have that, you're going to end up in a world of assumptions and clever people who think they know better.
Thank you very much, Alan, for joining us, and thank you very much for listening. As always, safety is paramount to the continued operations of the offshore sector in both renewables and oil and gas. And if you would like to stay up to date with all things industry, please stay tuned to Energy Voice Out Loud. Well, thank you very much, Alan. I think that's all we've got time for today.
Okay, good.